Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the cold, grey darkness of a medieval morning in 12th century England, into a world where a woman named Agnes woke before the sun had risen, in a single room that smelled of wood smoke and damp straw and animals, and where everything that modern people associate with comfort, with rest, with personal choice, and with bodily autonomy simply did not exist in any form she would have recognised. The life of a medieval wife was a life of almost unimaginable physical hardship, of legal invisibility, of relentless obligation from the very first hour of morning through to the last moments before an interrupted and uncomfortable sleep, and of an intimate life governed not by her own preferences or desires, but by the explicit teachings of the Church, the customary expectations of her husband, and the biological realities of a body that spent the majority of its adult years either pregnant, nursing, recovering from childbirth, or preparing for the next pregnancy. Tonight we're going to follow Agnes through a complete day. We will trace every hour from the moment she opens her eyes in the darkness before dawn, through the long, brutal stretch of her morning labour, through the demands placed upon her at midday, through her afternoons of unceasing domestic industry, through the rituals of her evening, and into the intimate and heavily regulated world of her nights. We will examine the horrifying realities of her marriage, her body, her legal standing, and the system of obligation that held her life in its steady, relentless grip. This is history told with complete honesty, exactly as the evidence records it. The daily life of a medieval wife in 12th and 13th century England was, by any honest measure, one of the most physically demanding, legally constrained, and personally unrewarding existences that any ordinary human being could inhabit, and yet it was the existence of the majority of adult women in Western Europe for several centuries, endured not because those women chose it freely, but because the entire institutional structure of medieval society, including its church, its law, its manorial economy, and its deeply ingrained customs of gender hierarchy, left them with no alternative that most of them could realistically access. The scholars who have studied this life most carefully, including Eileen Power in her foundational work Medieval Women, Barbara Hannawalt in her exhaustive study of the peasant family in medieval England based on coroners' rolls and manorial court records, and Judith Bennett in her examination of women and ale in medieval England, have all arrived at a similar conclusion, which is that the medieval wife's daily existence was structured by a system of expectations so comprehensive, so physically demanding, and so legally reinforced that it is difficult to find any hour of her waking day, or indeed many hours of her night, that she could claim as entirely her own. Tonight we're going to trace that existence with care and honesty, following the structure of the day itself, from the moment before dawn when Agnes rose to tend the fire, through the morning hours of cooking, brewing and outdoor labour, through the midday obligations to the manorial economy, here through the afternoon of textile production and childcare, through the evening rituals of the household, and into the night with its particular combination of exhaustion, intimate obligation, interrupted sleep, and the specific horrors of medieval childbirth and its consequences. We will not soften any of it. We will look at what the legal records show, what the Church actually taught, what the manorial court rolls reveal, and what the archaeological evidence confirms about the material conditions of this life. Before we begin, a warm and sincere word of thanks to everyone settling in tonight. If this kind of careful, detailed historical content is a welcome companion for your evening rest, a like or a share is genuinely appreciated, and subscribing helps others find this channel as well. We would love to hear in the comments which historical period you would most like to explore next, and we are always curious to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what hour it is as you make yourself comfortable. Let us begin at the very beginning, in the cold darkness before the first light of a medieval dawn, before the sun, the horrifying reality of a medieval morning. There is something deeply worth pausing to consider before we trace a single hour of Agnes's day, in the simple physical reality of the space in which she woke, the house in which she and her husband William, and their 4 surviving children lived, was a structure that no modern person would enter, without immediate and powerful discomfort. It measured approximately 16 metres in length and 5 metres in width, constructed of a timber frame filled with wattle and daub, roofed with a deep thatch of wheat straw that had been in place for 7 years and had in that time accumulated a thriving community of insects, mice and birds whose movements through the night created a continuous low-level acoustic backdrop to the household's sleep. The floor was packed earth, as darkened and hardened by years of foot traffic and the frequent application of water mixed with oxblood to bind the surface, but still capable of becoming slippery and damp in wet weather when moisture seeped through the base of the walls. There was no window in any modern sense, only 2 small openings in the walls covered with wooden shutters that could be propped open in warm weather, and in winter kept firmly closed against the cold, turning the interior into a dim, smoke-filled space lit only by the fire. That fire occupied the centre of the room in a stone-lined hearth that had no chimney above it. The smoke from the burning wood and turf rose freely into the interior of the house and found its way out gradually through the gap between the tops of the walls and the eaves of the roof, and through the thatch itself, which served in a real sense as the household's smoke ventilation system. The consequence of this arrangement was that the interior of the medieval peasant house was permanently smoky, particularly in cold weather when the shutters were closed and the fire was built up for warmth, and that every member of the household breathed a degree of wood smoke throughout the day that modern medical science would classify as a significant health hazard, associated with chronic respiratory irritation, increased susceptibility to respiratory infection, and long-term damage to the tissues of the throat and lungs. Archaeological examination of medieval skeletal remains from sites including the cemetery of St Nicholas Shambles in London, and the rural cemetery associated with the deserted village of Warham-Percy in the East Riding of Yorkshire has confirmed evidence of respiratory stress and sinusitis in a significant proportion of the adult population, consistent with chronic exposure to indoor air pollution of the kind produced by open hearth fires in enclosed spaces. Agnes woke in this space before dawn, typically around 4 o'clock in the morning in summer and somewhat later in winter, not because she chose to rise at this hour, but because the demands of the household left her no alternative. The fire needed to be tended before the room grew dangerously cold and the children shivered in their blankets. The animals in the lower section of the house, separated from the living space by a low timber partition, were stirring with the approach of morning and would need feeding and watering. The day's cooking needed to begin early enough that the pottage would be ready for the household's morning consumption before William left for the field strips, which he was required to begin working at first light during the busy seasons of the agricultural year. She rose from the sleeping platform, which was a low wooden structure raised a few inches from the floor and covered with a straw-stuffed mattress and the household's 2 woolen blankets, both of which she had woven herself over the course of 2 winters' worth of evenings spinning and weaving. Her feet met the cold earth floor, which in October or November carried a chill that she had learned long ago simply to ignore, because there was no alternative to ignoring it, and the alternative to rising was worse than the cold. She wore her linen shift, the basic undergarment that served as both her nightclothes and her foundational daytime garment, unwashed for several days and carrying the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and the various domestic odours of the household that had permeated it through continuous wear. She moved without light to the hearth, where the banked coals from the previous night glowed faintly under their covering of ash, and she knelt on the cold floor and began the careful work of coaxing the fire back to a proper flame. The preparation of the morning fire was not a simple task. It required the removal of the outer layer of ash without disturbing the surviving coals beneath, the careful placement of dry kindling in a configuration that would catch the heat of the coals without smothering them, and the gentle blowing that transferred the heat of the coals into the kindling. Agnes performed this task by feel and experience in near total darkness, her face close to the heat of the coals, her eyes stinging from the ash, and the thin thread of smoke that the disturbed fire produced before the new kindling caught. When the flame was established, she added progressively larger pieces of split wood, and then settled the iron pot, which contained the remnants of the previous day's pottage with fresh water added, on its hook above the growing fire, It is worth noting, before we continue, the precise physical condition of Agnes's body as she performed these tasks. She was 27 years old, and she had been pregnant 5 times in the 9 years since her marriage at the age of 18. 4 of her 5 children had survived infancy, an unusually good outcome by the standards of the period. The 5th, a boy born in the spring of 1143, had lived for 11 days before dying of what the local people called the summer fever, most likely a gastroenteric illness, of the kind that was extremely common among infants in the warm months when the preservation of food and water was most difficult. Her body showed the marks of these 5 pregnancies in the condition of her joints, her teeth, and her posture. 2 of her upper back teeth had been lost, a consequence of the calcium depletion of multiple pregnancies in a diet that provided insufficient dairy and therefore insufficient calcium replacement. Her lower back carried a persistent ache from the combination of the physical demands of pregnancy and the heavy lifting and stooping that filled every day of her working life. And in the cold morning air as she knelt by the fire, she was already aware of the slight nausea that told her she was, once again, in the early weeks of her 6th pregnancy. Let us now follow her through the full work of the morning and examine what these hours truly demanded of her. The morning's burden, cooking, brewing, and the economics of survival. The morning cooking that occupied the first 2 or 3 hours of Agnes's day was a task of genuine complexity and considerable physical effort, requiring her to manage multiple simultaneous processes in a confined and smoky space, while also attending to the children as they woke and required their own care, to the animals that needed feeding, and to the various other small emergencies and demands that the morning regularly produced. The pottage, which was the household's primary food at every meal, had been started with the reheating of the previous day's remnants, and the addition of fresh water and whatever new ingredients were available, and required regular stirring with a long wooden paddle to prevent the thickened grain mixture from settling to the bottom of the iron pot and burning against the hot metal. A burned pottage was a serious domestic failure, because it wasted food that the household could not afford to waste, and produced a bitter, scorched flavour that permeated even the portions that had not burned, making them much less palatable. The grain that provided the base of the pottage was oats in summer and rye in winter, the household's small store of the more expensive wheat being reserved for the occasional leavened loaf baked on feast days or when important visitors were expected. The oats or rye had been soaked overnight in cold water to begin the softening process, and were now stirred into the reheated pot, along with whatever the garden and the household's provisions could provide. In October, this might include dried peas that had been soaking since the previous evening, a handful of dried leeks from the string hanging from the roof beam, and a small piece of salt pork cut from the barrel of brine-preserved meat that represented the household's insurance against the hunger of deep winter. The pork was not added carelessly. Agnes measured its use with great precision, because the barrel contained only the meat from a single pig slaughtered at Martinmas, the feast of St. Martin on the 11th day of November, and it had to last the household through until the following Martinmas, a period of approximately 12 months during which it would serve as the primary source of animal protein and cooking fat in the household's diet. Cutting too generously from the barrel in October meant less to sustain the family through February and March, when the stored grain was at its lowest point and the garden had not yet produced its first spring growth. The bread baking, when it occurred, demanded its own considerable portion of the morning's attention. Agnes did not bake every day, because the fuel required to heat the hearth to bread baking temperature was expensive in terms of the labour needed to gather and split it, and because freshly baked bread was in any case a relative luxury in the peasant household that required more of everything, more flour, more fuel, more time, than the household could routinely afford to spend. More commonly, she baked every 3 or 4 days, producing a batch of 2 or 3 large round loaves of mixed rye and wheat flour that would serve as the household's bread supply until the next baking. The loaves were baked directly on the hearthstone, on a flat clay tile placed over the coals, or occasionally in a clay pot covered with a lid and surrounded by hot ashes, a technique that produced a reasonably even heat and a loaf with a thick, hard crust that could be stored for several days without developing serious mould. On the mornings when bread was to be baked, the preparation of the dough was the first task, undertaken even before the pottage was begun, because the leavened dough required a period of fermentation before it was ready for the oven. Agnes maintained her sourdough starter in a small earthenware crock, feeding it with flour and water every few days to keep the wild yeast culture alive and active. A portion of this starter was mixed with fresh flour, water and salt in a wooden bowl and worked by hand for a sustained period of kneading, which developed the gluten structure of the dough and distributed the yeast evenly through the mixture. The kneading of bread dough by hand, for a batch sufficient to produce 3 large loaves, required approximately 20 minutes of sustained physical effort, working the dough with the heels of the hands, folding it, turning it, pressing it again, a task performed in the early morning cold when the fire had not yet fully warmed the room, and the dough itself was cold and stiff and resistant. Alongside the cooking and the bread preparation, the morning's brewing occupied whatever moments Agnes could spare. The ale that the household consumed as its daily beverage was produced by Agnes in an ongoing cycle, with a new batch begun as the previous batch neared the end of its useful life. The process began with the heating of water in the second of the household's 2 iron pots, the addition of malted barley that had been purchased from the miller or produced from the household's own small barley crop, and the preparation of the wort through a process of mashing, sparging and boiling that required sustained attention and careful management of the fire to maintain the correct temperatures at each stage. The fermentation of the wort, once cooled and transferred to the wooden fermenting tub with the addition of some preserved yeast from the previous batch, took approximately 3 days, during which the tub had to be kept at a consistent temperature, protected from contamination by insects or household animals, and monitored for the signs of healthy fermentation that indicated the batch was proceeding correctly. The economic significance of the household brewing operation cannot be overstated when we consider the full picture of the medieval peasant household's domestic economy. Ale was not merely a beverage but a nutritional necessity, providing calories, B vitamins, and a degree of antimicrobial protection against the waterborne pathogens that made drinking unboiled water genuinely dangerous. A household that ran out of ale before the next batch was ready faced a genuine nutritional gap that could not easily be filled by any other available resource. Additionally, for women who produced more ale than the household consumed, the sale of the surplus at the village market or to neighbours represented one of the very few sources of independent income that the medieval peasant wife could access. The regulation of this trade by the manorial court through the assize of ale, and the fines regularly imposed on women who brewed ale of insufficient quality or at prices above the regulated maximum, represented a direct intrusion of the manorial economy into the wife's most economically significant activity. The assize of ale was a royal regulation whose origins lay in the assize of bread and ale issued in the year 1266 of the Common Era, under the reign of King Henry III of England, and which set the permissible prices of both bread and ale in relation to the current price of the grain from which they were made. The purpose of this regulation was to prevent profiteering in essential foodstuffs during periods of grain scarcity, when prices rose sharply and the temptation to pass increased costs onto the consumer in excess of what was strictly justified was strong. The enforcement of the assize was delegated to the manorial court, which through the institution of the presentment jury, a group of villagers sworn to report all violations of the assize within the manor, maintained a system of regular oversight of the ale trade that was, by the standards of most medieval economic regulation, remarkably thorough and remarkably well documented. The court rolls of English manors from the 13th and 14th centuries contain thousands of presentments of women for selling ale contrary to the assize, making this the single most commonly recorded female economic activity in the entire corpus of medieval manorial documentation. The interesting feature of this system, as the historian Judith Bennett has argued in her careful study of women and the ale trade in medieval England, is that the fines imposed by the manorial court for violations of the assize were in many cases not genuine penalties intended to deter future violations, but rather licensing fees, and were accepted as a regular cost of doing business by the women who paid them, and collected as a regular source of manorial revenue by the Lord's administration. The persistence of the same women's names in successive manorial court rolls as presentees for ale violations year after year without any apparent cessation of their brewing activity strongly supports the interpretation of these fines as de facto licenses, a regularised extraction of a portion of the brewing income by the manorial authority rather than a genuine attempt to control the quality or price of the ale trade. Let us now move carefully from the kitchen and the brewing to the broader context of the morning's outdoor work, the body under obligation, physical labour and the demands of the manorial system. The morning hours of Agnes's day extended far beyond the interior of the house, into the yard, the garden, the byre, and in certain seasons the open fields of the manorial landscape, because the obligations placed upon her body by the combined demands of the household, the manorial system, and the seasonal agricultural calendar did not recognise any boundary between domestic interior and outdoor agricultural space. Her body was a resource deployed across all of these domains simultaneously, and the management of that deployment, the constant calculation of which task was most urgent at any given moment, and what could be deferred until later without catastrophic consequence, was itself an exhausting cognitive labour that added its weight to the already substantial physical demands of the work itself. The byre, where the household's 2 oxen, 3 pigs, 4 goats, and the dozen or so chickens were housed in winter, required her attention within the first hour of rising. The oxen, which were not strictly the property of the household, but were shared between 4 families through a cooperative arrangement common in the village, needed to be fed their morning ration of hay from the household's diminishing winter store, watered from the trough that she refilled with 2 full buckets carried from the well, and their accumulated dung cleared from the sleeping area to prevent the dangerous build-up of ammonia that could damage the animals' respiratory systems and reduce their productive capacity. This last task was performed with a wooden-handled iron scraper and a flat shovel, the dung collected in a wooden barrow and transferred to the midden heap at the edge of the yard, from which it would be spread on the garden and field strips in spring as the primary fertilising agent for the season's crops. The smell of this work was powerful and unavoidable, and Agnes had long since ceased to notice it with any particular attention. The obligation to contribute labour service to the lord of the manor's home farm or domain was one of the most defining features of the medieval peasant wife's relationship to the broader economic system in which she lived. Under the terms of William's villein tenure, the household owed 2 days of labour service per week to the domain throughout the agricultural year, with additional special services called boon works required at peak agricultural moments, particularly at ploughing in spring and at harvest in late summer. These labour services were technically owed by William as the named tenant, but the manorial court records of the period, preserved in archives across England, make clear that wives and older children regularly contributed to the fulfilment of these obligations, particularly during harvest, when every available body was required in the field. When Agnes herself was required to appear for labour service, which happened regularly during the harvest season and occasionally at other times, she did so while simultaneously managing the full weight of her domestic responsibilities. The children under the age of 8 who could not be trusted to manage themselves at home would be brought with her to the harvest field, where the younger ones might be laid on a blanket at the field margin while she worked, or left in the nominal supervision of an older sibling not yet strong enough for full agricultural work. The harvest work itself was brutally physical, requiring the repeated stooping and straightening of binding cut grain into sheaves, a motion that placed enormous strain on the lower back, and the carrying of heavy sheaves from the cut area to the stacking point, work performed under the pressure of weather anxiety, and the knowledge that the crop must be brought in before rain or wind could flatten or rot the standing grain. The manorial court to which William was obligated to present himself for the regular court sessions, held 3 or 4 times per year in the great hall of the manor house or in the village church, was an institution whose decisions affected Agnes's daily life profoundly, even in those sessions where she was not personally a party to any business before the court. The court determined the allocation of field strips in the open field system, regulated the common rights of grazing and woodland access, on which the household's animal economy depended, collected the various customary payments that the manorial tenants owed to the lord, and adjudicated disputes between neighbours about boundaries, debts and damages. And our Agnes's own appearances before the manorial court were primarily as a defendant in presentments related to the ale she brewed and sold. For the manorial records of English villages through the 12th and 13th centuries are full of exactly these kinds of presentments. Women cited for selling ale at above the regulated price, for selling ale of below the required quality, or for selling ale without the correct measure. The physical condition of the yard and the immediate surroundings of the house presented its own particular category of daily management obligation. The yard, which lay between the house and the road through the village, was a working space where the pigsty, the henhouse, the woodpile, the well or water butt, the midden heap, and the various tools of agricultural and domestic work were arranged in an organisation that reflected the practical logic of the household's daily operations. Keeping this space clean of the accumulated waste produced by animals, humans, and the various domestic processes that took place within it was a continuous task, because the accumulation of organic waste in close proximity to the house created conditions for the proliferation of rats, flies, and the various pathogens associated with contaminated organic matter. The medieval understanding of this relationship was practical rather than theoretical, expressed not in the language of germ theory, but in the empirical observation that dirty households suffered more illness than clean ones, and Agnes's management of the yard was shaped by this kind of accumulated practical knowledge. The rats that shared the medieval peasant household were a persistent and serious problem rather than a minor inconvenience, because they consumed and contaminated the stored grain that was the household's primary food reserve, carried various parasites and pathogens, including the fleas that served as vectors for the bubonic plague, though the Great Plague of 1348 had not yet occurred in Agnes's time, and posed a genuine physical threat to the youngest and most vulnerable members of the household, since medieval rats were large, numerous, and bold in the presence of sleeping infants. The management of the rat population was a continuous effort, involving the maintenance of cats, which every peasant household kept primarily as rat catchers rather than as companions, the careful construction and repair of grain storage vessels to minimise the rat's ability to access the stored grain, and the setting of various traps and deterrents whose specific forms are occasionally described in medieval agricultural and household management texts. The woodpile, which represented a significant portion of the household's winter fuel supply, and which had been accumulated through the summer months from the household's entitlement to gather wood from the lord's woodland under the customary rite known as houseboat, needed to be maintained in a state of dryness that preserved its burning quality and prevented the rot that could destroy an entire season's fuel gathering within a few weeks of winter damp. Agnes managed the woodpile by ensuring that it was stacked away from the ground on rough log supports, covered with a layer of old thatch or a piece of spare timber to deflect the worst of the rain, and drawn from in an order that used the oldest and driest wood first, while the newest additions to the pile continued to season. This kind of careful, systematic resource management, applied to every consumable in the household's possession, was the invisible architecture of the peasant household's survival, maintained entirely in the wife's practical intelligence and daily attention. Let us now move forward to the midday hours and the particular obligations that the middle of the day placed upon her. Noon, the weight of the middle hours and the invisible economy. The hour of midday in the medieval village was marked by the ringing of the church bell for the office of sext, the noon prayer of the canonical hours, and it arrived with its own particular quality of demand. The morning's most urgent tasks had been accomplished, or at least begun. The fire was established, the pottage was simmering, the animals had been tended, and the first portion of the day's outdoor labour had been completed. But the midday hour brought with it its own category of obligations, most of them related to the household's participation in the local economy and the broader social world of the village. And these obligations were no less demanding for being less physically violent than the work of the early morning, the village market. When it fell on a weekday within reach of the household schedule, was an essential destination that Agnes visited as often as her domestic obligations permitted. The market town nearest to her village was Grantham, in the county of Lincolnshire, a distance of approximately 8 miles along the Roman road that still served as the principal route of communication through this part of England. This was too far for a regular market visit on foot, and Agnes typically made the journey only once a fortnight, or perhaps once a month, on occasions when the accumulation of goods for sale from the household's small surplus production justified the investment of a full day's travel. These goods might include eggs from the household's hens, butter or soft cheese made from the goat's milk when the animals were in good production, small quantities of garden vegetables in season, or the surplus ale from a batch that had turned out larger than the household's immediate consumption required. The social world encountered on the road to market and at the market itself was one of the most important dimensions of Agnes's experience of a world beyond the boundaries of her village. Medieval markets were not merely commercial events, but social occasions of considerable complexity, where information was exchanged alongside goods, where relationships of credit and obligation were negotiated and renewed, where the news of the wider world filtered down from the travellers and merchants who passed through, and where the hierarchies and alliances of village life were publicly performed and reinforced. Agnes knew the market traders of Grantham by name and reputation, knew which stallholders would give fair measure and which would try to cheat an unwary customer, knew the current prices for the goods she needed to buy and the goods she had to sell, and brought this knowledge to bear in her market transactions with a commercial competence that was entirely invisible to the formal economic record of the period, which recognised her as a legal nonentity subsumed within her husband's legal identity. The institution of feme covert, the legal doctrine that upon marriage a woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband, meant that Agnes could not in formal legal theory enter into contracts, hold property in her own name, or sue, or be sued in the royal courts without her husband's formal participation. In practice, however, the gap between this formal legal principle and the actual behaviour documented in the manorial court records was very wide indeed. Women appear in those records as creditors seeking repayment of loans of grain, of money, and of household goods extended to neighbours. They appear as defendants in disputes about the quality and price of ale. They appear as witnesses to transactions and as parties to the informal credit arrangements that served as the primary lubricant of the village economy. The manorial court, which operated under customary rather than common law, was considerably more pragmatic about women's economic agency than the formal common law principle of feme covert would suggest, because the practical management of the village economy simply could not function without the active economic participation of the women who were deeply embedded in it at every level. The midday meal, eaten by the household whenever the morning's various labours had been brought to a resting point, was a simple affair. The pottage was ladled into wooden bowls and eaten with bread, sometimes with a piece of hard cheese or a few pickled onions from the household store of preserved vegetables, and drunk with ale. The entire meal was consumed quickly, without ceremony, often with the children eating while standing or sitting on the earthen floor around the hearth, and without any of the more elaborate rituals that accompanied the meal in wealthier households. Afterwards, the bowls were rinsed in water and the household moved immediately back into the afternoon's work without pause for rest. The credit economy of the medieval village, in which Agnes participated as both lender and borrower in a continuous web of small-scale financial obligation, was a social institution of considerable complexity, whose operation was entirely informal, but whose social consequences were very real and very precisely tracked by the participants. A neighbour who borrowed a measure of grain in February when her own store had run short would be expected to return the same measure plus a small additional quantity after the harvest, an arrangement negotiated verbally and remembered by both parties with an accuracy that the absence of written records made absolutely necessary. Agnes maintained in her memory a detailed account of every outstanding obligation she held with her neighbours, both as creditor and as debtor, and the management of these informal credit relationships was a continuous social labour that accompanied her through every interaction in the village. The concept of a midday rest, which in some Mediterranean agricultural traditions was a recognised institution, allowing workers to escape the heat of the afternoon sun, had no meaningful equivalent in the English peasant household, where the shortness of the working day in winter and the relentlessness of the summer agricultural calendar left no room for such indulgence. Let us now turn carefully to the afternoon's particular demands and the intimate life of the household's domestic interior. The afternoon, textile labour, medical reality, and the endless domestic interior. The afternoon hours of Agnes's day settled into the particular rhythm of the domestic interior, a rhythm that was no less demanding for being more stationary than the outdoor work of the morning, and that required its own forms of sustained physical effort and concentrated practical attention. The textile work that occupied the centre of the afternoon was the most economically significant of all the productive activities performed within the household, because the clothing, bedding and domestic textiles produced by this work represented, in terms of the labour invested in their creation, the single largest productive output of the household after the agricultural labour of the field strips. The drop spindle that Agnes carried with her through every non-cooking hour of her day was a simple object of profound significance. It consisted of a smooth wooden shaft approximately 25 centimetres in length, weighted at its lower end with a disc of baked clay approximately 7 centimetres in diameter, bored through its centre to accept the shaft. The whirl, as this weighted disc was called, provided the rotational inertia that allowed the spindle to spin freely for an extended period once set in motion, and it was this sustained rotation that did the actual work of twisting the drawn-out wool fibres into thread. Agnes had been spinning with a drop spindle since the age of 6, taught by her mother in the same way that her mother had been taught by her mother, and her technique was so deeply practiced that it required almost no conscious attention, allowing her hands to continue spinning while her eyes and mind attended to other matters, including the supervision of the children, the monitoring of the cooking pot, or the mental accounting of the household's provisions and obligations. The raw wool that Agnes spun came primarily from the household's 2 sheep, which grazed on the village common through the summer months and were housed in the byre in winter. 2 sheep produced a modest amount of wool at the annual shearing in June, supplemented by small purchases of additional raw wool at the Grantham market, and Agnes's goal was to spin sufficient thread each year to allow the weaving of approximately 5 to 6 yards of woolen cloth, enough to provide rough fabric for 1 new garment for each member of the household every 2 or 3 years, and to allow for the repair and patching of existing garments in the intervals. The vertical warp-weighted loom that stood against the far wall of the house was her weaving equipment, a frame of 2 upright posts supporting a horizontal beam from which the warp threads hung, weighted with clay loom weights, several of which had been in the household's possession long enough to have been found and recognised as medieval artefacts by later archaeologists. The medical care of the household's children was an afternoon obligation that could not be scheduled or predicted. The 4 surviving children of Agnes and William ranged in age from 2 years to 8 years, and all 4 were in the constant low-level state of minor illness and injury that characterised childhood in the medieval peasant environment. The 2-year-old had a persistent cough from the combination of the smoky interior air and the cold and damp of the autumn weather. The 4-year-old had a healing burn on his right hand where he had touched the iron pot a week earlier, a wound that Agnes was treating with a daily application of fresh goose fat covered with a linen bandage, following the same approach that her mother had used for burns, and which the slightly more formal herbalist tradition recorded in texts such as the Anglo-Saxon Leech Book of Bald, compiled in the 9th century of the Common Era and surviving in a manuscript now preserved in the British Library in London, recommended for similar injuries. The herbalist knowledge that Agnes deployed in these medical situations was a body of practical information transmitted entirely through oral tradition and direct demonstration, with no reference to any written text and no connection to the formal medical learning of the university-trained physicians who served the wealthy households of the noble and ecclesiastical elite. It was knowledge grounded in observation and experience, telling her that chamomile flowers boiled in water and given as a drink settled the stomach cramps that sometimes afflicted the younger children, that bruised plantain leaves applied to a bee sting reduced the swelling, that a poultice of comfrey root crushed and mixed with the lard soothed the pain of sprains and bruises, and that the juice of elderberries given in warm water is helped in the management of winter fevers. Some of this knowledge was accurate and beneficial by the standards of modern pharmacology. Some of it, including the use of Aristolochia, known as birthwort and recommended in some traditions for complications of childbirth, was genuinely toxic and capable of causing serious kidney damage, a fact that the women who used it had no means of knowing and that modern analysis has only recently established. The afternoon also contained, on certain days, the obligation of attendance at the parish church for specific religious observances that fell within the working week. The major feast days of the church calendar, of which there were approximately 40 each year not counting Sundays, required the cessation of agricultural work and attendance at Mass, a requirement that applied theoretically to all members of the parish community regardless of their agricultural obligations or their domestic demands. In practice, the wife's attendance at these weekday feast day masses was more irregular than her husband's, because the domestic obligations of the household, including the care of very young children and the management of cooking and animals, created legitimate reasons for her to be absent from the church on any given occasion, and the parish priest of a 12th century English village was unlikely to pursue her absence with the same vigour that a later period ecclesiastical administration might bring to bear. Let us now follow Agnes through the particular rituals of her evening and into the night that waited beyond them. The evening, ritual, exhaustion, and the architecture of domesticity. The evening in the medieval peasant household arrived not as a gradual social transition from work to leisure, in the way that modern people might understand the movement from the working day into the personal time of the evening, but as a continuation of work in a slightly different register, with the specific tasks of the late afternoon giving way to the specific tasks associated with the preparation and consumption of the evening meal, the final management of the animals, and the social and domestic activities that occupied the household in the last hours before sleep. There was no leisure in the evening in any meaningful sense for Agnes, because the concept of leisure, of time genuinely free from productive obligation and available for rest or pleasure for its own sake, simply did not exist as a recognisable category of experience in the peasant wife's daily life. The preparation of the evening meal was in most respects a continuation and completion of the morning's cooking rather than a separate operation. The pottage that had been begun in the early morning hours had been simmering slowly through the entire day, and by the late afternoon it had reached its most fully developed state, the grains thoroughly broken down into a smooth, thick consistency, the dried peas and beans softened to the point of partial dissolution, the salt pork having surrendered its flavour entirely to the surrounding liquid, and the various dried herbs and vegetables having contributed their particular qualities to a preparation that was nutritious, filling, and in its own modest way flavoursome. Agnes stirred it once more, adjusted the fire to maintain a steady temperature, and began the preparation of the bread that would accompany it. The evening meal was eaten at the trestle table that was assembled for the purpose by placing 2 pairs of crossed wooden legs with a board across them, the table being dismantled again after the meal was finished to free the floor space for sleeping. William sat at the head of this table on the household's single chair, a piece of furniture that Agnes had seen him occupy at every meal of their 9 years of marriage without ever sitting in it herself. She sat on the bench at his side, or occasionally on a 3-legged stool at right angles to the table, and managed the serving of the food and ale while eating her own portion, between the tasks of filling and refilling the other members of the household's bowls and cups. The children sat on the bench or on the floor, depending upon their age and the space available, eating in the order of their size and their usefulness to the household's economy, the older, more productive children receiving larger and earlier portions than the younger ones. The conversation that accompanied the meal was not of the comfortable, discursive kind that modern people might associate with a shared family dinner, but was principally informational in character, consisting of William's report on the day's fieldwork, Agnes's account of the morning's market transaction, or the condition of the stored grain or the health of the animals, and whatever news of the village and the wider community she had gathered through her movements through the day. Agnes was, in practice, the household's primary intelligence resource in the social world of the village. Her daily interactions with neighbours, traders, the alewife at the alehouse, the women gathered at the well, and the occasional traveller on the road providing a richer and more varied picture of the community's current affairs than William's more focused daily experience in the field strips allowed him to accumulate. This informational role was entirely unofficial, entirely unrecognised by any formal structure, and entirely essential to the household's practical management of its affairs within the social context of the village. After the meal was finished and the bowls rinsed, Agnes managed the final tasks of the evening. The fire was banked with large turves and green wood that would burn slowly through the night and preserve the coals for morning. The animals were checked one final time, the hens counted to ensure none had been taken by a fox, the pigs settled in their sty, the oxen given a last armful of hay. The children were arranged on the sleeping platform in order of size, the youngest nearest the warmth of the fire, the oldest at the cooler far end of the sleeping space. Agnes nursed the 2-year-old for the last time that evening, and sitting by the fire in the dim light of a single tallow candle that she would snuff before she herself lay down, and in the quiet of this last nursing she had perhaps the single, most genuinely private and peaceful moment of her entire day. It lasted perhaps a quarter of an hour. The candle that provided this evening light was made from tallow, which is rendered animal fat, typically from mutton or beef, and its quality of light was both dim and accompanied by a faint but persistent smell of burning fat that permeated the room and settled into the hair and clothing of anyone who sat near it. Beeswax candles, which burned more clearly and with a pleasanter scent, were considerably more expensive, costing approximately 4 times the price of tallow candles by weight, and their use was reserved in the peasant household for the most special occasions, if they were used at all. More commonly, the household supplemented or replaced candles with rushlights, made by peeling a common rush to leave only a thin strip of pith along one side, dipping the prepared rush in melted tallow and allowing it to harden in a holder that gripped it at an angle of approximately 45 degrees. A rushlight produced even less light than a tallow candle, burning for perhaps 20 to 30 minutes per foot of rush, but it cost almost nothing beyond the labour of preparation, and a household that gathered and prepared its rushes diligently in the autumn could maintain a supply of rushlights through the winter months at minimal expense. In the last light of the evening candle, Agnes would often continue spinning, the distaff tucked under her left arm and the drop spindle rotating in her right hand, producing the thread that was the household's textile foundation, until the candle burned too low to provide useful light, and the fire's glow was insufficient for this fine work. Then she would wind the day's thread onto its bobbin, set the spindle aside and move towards sleep with the particular kind of physical and mental exhaustion that is the specific product of sustained, multitasked labour, performed under the pressure of genuine material necessity. Then the child was settled, the candle was extinguished, and Agnes lay down in the dark beside her husband, and the night began with its own particular set of demands and obligations. The marriage, legal bondage, and the structure of obligation. To understand the night that awaited Agnes, we must first understand the precise nature of the institution of marriage as it existed in 12th century England, because the legal and theological framework of medieval marriage was not a vague cultural backdrop to the intimate life of the medieval couple, but was an extraordinarily detailed and actively enforced system of regulations that governed what happened between husband and wife in the most private dimensions of their lives with a specificity that most modern people would find remarkable and many would find disturbing. Medieval marriage as an institution was governed by a combination of canon law, the law of the Catholic Church administered through the ecclesiastical court system, and customary law as enforced through the manorial court, with the developing common law of the royal courts providing an additional layer of regulation, particularly as it concerned property rights. The canon law of marriage had been given its most systematic formal expression in the 12th century through the work of scholars including Peter Lombard of Paris, whose 4 books of sentences, composed around the year 1150 of the Common Era, established a theological framework for thinking about marriage that would dominate Catholic teaching for centuries, and through the canon law compilations of Gratian, whose decretum, assembled at Bologna around the year 1140 of the Common Era, brought together and organised the enormous body of earlier canonical material relating to marriage into a systematic legal form. The canonical theory of marriage held, most fundamentally, that a valid marriage was constituted by the free consent of the two parties, expressed in words of the present tense in the formula known as the verba de presenti. A woman who said, "I take thee as my husband," and a man who responded, "I take thee as my wife," were, under canonical theory, married from that moment, regardless of whether any witness was present, any ceremony performed, or any priest involved. This principle, which prioritized internal consent over external ceremony, had been established in part through the theological argument of Peter Lombard himself, who explicitly stated that it was consent and not consummation that made a marriage, though he acknowledged that consummation created a bond of additional theological significance, the symbolism of the indissoluble union of Christ with his church. In practice, the canonical insistence on free consent as the foundation of marriage existed alongside a social reality in which most marriages, particularly among the peasant class, were arranged by the heads of the families involved with primary attention to the economic and social advantage of the arrangement, and in which the wife's consent was obtained as a formality rather than as a genuine exercise of autonomous choice. The manorial custom in many English villages gave the lord of the manor a right of oversight over the marriages of his female villeins, expressed through the payment called merce, a fine paid to the lord when a villein's daughter married, which in theory compensated the lord for the loss of the daughter's future productive labour to another household, and which in practice served as a financial reminder of the lord's continuing interest in the management of the villein family's reproductive economy. Merchet payments are recorded in manorial accounts throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, providing one of the clearest documentary traces of the manorial system's direct reach into the most intimate decisions of the peasant family's life. The common law doctrine of feme covert, as it developed through the 12th and 13th centuries and was articulated in the legal treatise attributed to the royal justice Henry de Bracton, written around the year 1250 of the Common Era, established the principle that upon marriage, the wife's legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband to the extent that she could not hold property independently, enter into legally binding contracts, or bring legal actions in the royal courts, except in her husband's name and with his formal participation. This principle was not merely theoretical, but had direct practical consequences for Agnes's daily life in every dimension of her economic and social activity. The brewing income she generated, the credit she extended to neighbours, the small savings she might accumulate from the sale of surplus domestic produce, all of these were legally the property of her husband and subject to his management and disposal. She had no formal mechanism for accumulating independent resources, no legal protection for any economic activity she undertook independently, and no recourse against William if he chose to appropriate or dispose of anything she had produced. The emotional and psychological dimensions of medieval marriage are considerably harder to recover from the historical record than its legal and economic aspects, but the manorial court records, the occasional personal letter preserved from slightly wealthier social strata, and the evidence of the literary tradition of the period all provide glimpses of a range of marital experience that included genuine affection and mutual respect alongside exploitation, indifference, and violence. The ecclesiastical court records of the period, which dealt with cases of marriage dissolution, wife-beating, and desertion, document the frequency with which medieval marriages were marked by violence from the husband toward the wife, a violence that the Church's official position condemned in theory, while the legal reality provided almost no effective recourse for the wife who suffered it. The canonical teaching that a husband had the right to chastise his wife, provided the correction was proportionate to the offence and did not result in permanent injury, was a formulation that in practice left the definition of proportionate entirely to the husband, and the beatings recorded in the court documents of the period range from what even contemporary observers considered excessive to what the same observers regarded as perfectly normal domestic correction. The wife's options when faced with domestic violence in her marriage were severely limited by the combined effects of her legal status as feme covert, which prevented her from bringing an independent legal action in the royal courts, her economic dependence on her husband for the household's means of subsistence, the social pressure of the village community to maintain the appearance of marital order, and the Church's own ambivalent teaching on the subject, which condemned excessive violence but recognised the husband's right to domestic authority in terms that made any appeal to the Church a complex and uncertain undertaking. The ecclesiastical court to which the wife could in theory appeal against a violent husband sat at a distance from the village that was in itself a practical barrier to access, required the engagement of proctors and legal processes that demanded resources of money, literacy, and social connection that most peasant women did not possess, and produced outcomes that were frequently inadequate to provide genuine protection for the woman bringing the complaint. The widow, by contrast, occupied a legal position of considerably greater independence than the married woman, because widowhood conferred the status of feme sole, literally a single woman, which restored the full legal capacity to hold property, enter contracts, and pursue legal actions that marriage had removed. The dower right, which entitled the widow to 1/3 of her late husband's real property as her means of support in widowhood, was recognised and enforced by both canon law and common law, and the manorial court records are full of cases in which widows successfully pursue their dower rights against the families and heirs of their deceased husbands, sometimes with considerable tenacity and legal sophistication. This greater legal independence of the widow explains a feature of medieval social life that initially seems paradoxical, which is that widows frequently resisted remarriage in ways that married women did not resist their initial marriage, because the legal independence of widowhood was itself a form of freedom whose value was fully apparent only to those who had experienced the legal constraints of the feme covert status in its active form. Let us now turn to the specific and heavily regulated dimension of Agnes's nights, and to the intimate obligations that the Church's teaching placed upon her body. The knight's first demand, the marital debt, and the Church's regulation of intimacy. The Catholic Church's teaching on the intimate life of married couples was, by the 12th century, one of the most elaborately developed bodies of theological and canonical regulation in the entire system of medieval ecclesiastical law, produced through centuries of reflection by theologians and canon lawyers, who were, almost without exception, men who had never been married, and whose knowledge of the experience they were regulating was entirely theoretical and entirely mediated through the lens of a theological tradition that regarded sexual activity with deep and persistent ambivalence. The result of this centuries-long male theological reflection on the intimate life of married women was a system of rules so detailed, so comprehensive, and so intrusive that it specified not only when sexual intercourse within marriage was permitted and when it was forbidden, but also the permissible positions, the appropriate purposes, the prohibited forms of contraceptive intent, and the degree of pleasure that could be experienced without moral guilt. All of this enforced through the institution of the confessional, where the medieval penitent was expected to examine her intimate life and report any violations to her confessor with sufficient detail to allow him to assess the gravity of the sin and impose an appropriate penance. The foundational concept through which the Church regulated the intimate life of married couples was the doctrine of the debitum conjugal, the marital debt, derived primarily from the 7th chapter of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, in which Paul stated explicitly that the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and equally that the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does, and that they should not refuse each other except perhaps by mutual agreement for a period of prayer. This text, which established the principle of mutual and equal sexual obligation between husband and wife, was interpreted in the canonical tradition of the 12th century through the lens of an increasingly detailed analysis of the circumstances, purposes, and conditions of legitimate marital intercourse. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, and building upon the earlier tradition that included the work of Peter Lombard and the canonical analysis of Gratian, argued that the rendering of the marital debt when requested by either spouse was a morally obligatory act that could not be refused without sin, except in specific circumstances enumerated in the canonical literature. These exceptions included the state of serious illness or physical incapacity, a vow of abstinence made by mutual agreement, the period of public penance imposed by the confessor for serious sin, and certain times of the liturgical year during which the Church's tradition encouraged abstinence from intimate relations. The act of rendering the marital debt, when performed without any further positive moral qualification, was classified by Aquinas as venial sin at worst and morally neutral at best, a position that represented a moderate middle ground between the more restrictive earlier tradition and the somewhat more permissive later scholastic analysis. The calendar of sexual restriction within marriage that emerged from the canonical tradition was, when fully articulated, of remarkable comprehensiveness. Sexual intercourse between husband and wife was prohibited during the 40 days of Lent preceding Easter Sunday, during the 40 days of Advent preceding Christmas, during the period from Pentecost to the octave of Pentecost, on the eve and the day of the major feasts of the church calendar, including Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the Feast of the Apostles, and the Feast of the Virgin Mary, on Sundays as the Christian day of rest and prayer, on Wednesdays and Fridays as the traditional penitential days of the week, and during the period of the wife's menstruation, which the canonical tradition following the Levitical tradition regarded as a state of impurity that made intimate contact improper. Additionally, sexual relations were prohibited for a period following childbirth until the wife had undergone the churching ceremony, a ritual of purification and blessing administered by the parish priest, which typically occurred 40 days after the birth, corresponding to the 40 days of Mary's purification following the birth of Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of Luke. When all of these prohibitions are enumerated and their combined effect calculated against a calendar of 365 days per year, the result is striking. The historian Pierre Payer, in his scholarly examination of sex and the penitentials, has calculated that the days theoretically available for marital intercourse, when all canonical prohibitions are fully observed, amount to fewer than 90 days in a typical year, and possibly considerably fewer depending upon the specific local tradition being followed. This calculation gives us an important frame of reference for understanding the intimate life of Agnes and William, though it should be immediately balanced by the observation that the gap between canonical prescription and actual practice among the peasant population of 12th century England was almost certainly very large, for reasons that include the limited theological education of the peasant population, the irregular contact of most peasants with their parish priest, the very general and imprecise nature of most sermons and confessional instruction at the parish level, and the simple practical reality of two people sharing a bed in a cold room with limited privacy and very human physical needs. The evidence of Agnes's 5 pregnancies in 9 years of marriage provides a different kind of data point for thinking about the actual frequency of intimate relations in her marriage, suggesting that the canonical restrictions, whatever their theoretical authority, did not in practice reduce the rate of conception to anything approaching what full compliance would have produced. Medieval demographers and historians have estimated, on the basis of the parish records and other documentary sources available from slightly later periods, that the average interval between pregnancies in the medieval peasant population, adjusted for periods of breastfeeding during which conception was somewhat less likely, though by no means impossible, was approximately 20 to 24 months, suggesting a pattern of intimate relations broadly consistent with monthly or more frequent activity rather than the canonical maximum of approximately 90 days per year. Let us now turn to the specific physical and medical realities of pregnancy and childbirth in Agnes's world, because these were the most direct and most horrifying consequences of the intimate life of the medieval wife, pregnancy and the horror of medieval childbirth. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth in 12th century England was, for the peasant wife, a recurring encounter with the possibility of death, experienced not as a distant statistical abstraction, but as an immediate physical reality confirmed by the direct experience of loss and danger that surrounded her in the community of women who shared her circumstances. Agnes had lost her own mother in childbirth when Agnes was 12 years old, watching as her mother laboured for 3 days with a poorly positioned baby before dying of the physical exhaustion and the complications of a delivery that the midwife was ultimately unable to manage. She had attended 2 neighbours' childbirths in the years since her own marriage, one of which had ended successfully and one of which had ended with the death of both the mother and the infant. She approached each of her own pregnancies with a practical knowledge of the risks that was not theoretical, but grounded in personal observation and personal loss. The recognition of pregnancy in the medieval period was accomplished through a combination of physical symptom observation and the various diagnostic methods described in the medical literature of the period, including the examination of the urine, which medieval medical theory held could reveal the presence and progress of pregnancy through changes in its colour, clarity and smell, and the direct observation of the physical signs of breast changes, cessation of menstruation, and the nausea and food aversions that many pregnant women experience in the early weeks. Agnes recognised her current 6th pregnancy through the morning nausea that had become familiar through 5 previous pregnancies, and through the particular fatigue of the early weeks that she had learned to distinguish from the ordinary tiredness of her daily labour. The management of pregnancy in the peasant household proceeded without any formal medical attention, in the vast majority of cases, because the physicians of the period, trained in the universities of Paris, Bologna, Salerno and Oxford, in the Galenic medical tradition that had been preserved and expanded through Arabic scholarship, served exclusively the wealthy households of the aristocracy, the episcopate, and the most prosperous urban merchants, and had no connection to the daily reality of the peasant community. Mum Agnes's medical resource during pregnancy was the accumulated traditional knowledge of the village's older women, the occasional advice of the midwife who would attend the birth, and her own experience of 5 previous pregnancies. This knowledge included practical dietary advice, the avoidance of heavy lifting and violent physical exertion in the later stages of pregnancy, the use of specific herbal preparations to manage nausea and the leg cramps that commonly affected pregnant women, and the various spiritual interventions of prayer and the veneration of St. Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of pregnant women and childbirth in the medieval Catholic tradition. The childbirth itself, when the time came, was managed by the midwife in the company of the female neighbours who attended every birth in the village as a matter of social solidarity and mutual obligation. From the moment labour began, the house was transformed into a female space from which William and any male visitors were excluded, the shutters drawn and the fire built up high to produce the warmth that the medical tradition associated with safe delivery. The midwife brought with her a supply of oil for lubricating the birth canal, clean rags for absorbing the blood and fluids of delivery, and her own body of practical knowledge about the management of normal and abnormal presentations, developed through years of attendance at deliveries across the village and the surrounding community. Medieval obstetric knowledge, as preserved in the texts available to the more literate practitioners of the period, was a mixture of genuinely useful practical observation and theoretical constructs of limited or negative value. The work attributed to Trotula of Salerno, a figure whose historical reality has been extensively debated by scholars, including Monica Green in her careful examination of the Trotula texts, provided a body of gynecological and obstetric knowledge that circulated in Latin manuscripts among the educated class, and filtered downward in simplified form through the oral tradition of midwives and experienced women. Genuinely helpful techniques described in this tradition included the manual correction of malpositioned babies, the use of oil and warm baths to relax the birth canal, and the importance of keeping the labouring woman warm and supported. Less helpful or actively harmful elements included the use of toxic plant preparations to stimulate contractions, the application of magical and religious techniques including the writing of sacred words on a piece of parchment placed against the labouring woman's thigh, and the administration of various concoctions of animal and plant products recommended in the herbal tradition, without any empirical basis in the outcome of deliveries. The mortality rate associated with childbirth in medieval England is not precisely known, because the documentary evidence does not permit the kind of systematic analysis that modern demographic study requires. However, the available evidence from the study of medieval skeletal remains, from the ecclesiastical and administrative records of the period, and from the patterns visible in the wills and property transfers of medieval women, consistently suggests that death in or following childbirth was a significant cause of mortality among women of childbearing age, and that the cumulative risk of maternal death across a woman's reproductive lifetime was meaningful. For Agnes, now entering her 6th pregnancy, the statistical accumulation of that risk was a practical consideration, however she might frame it in the theological language of God's will and the protection of St. Margaret. The complications that could arise during and following childbirth were numerous, poorly understood in terms of their causes, and in many cases entirely beyond the management capacity of the midwife and the attending women. Obstructed labour, in which the baby was too large, poorly positioned, or unable to pass through the birth canal for any of several anatomical reasons, was managed in the medieval period primarily by manual manipulation of the baby's position, a technique that could succeed when the cause of obstruction was positional, but that could cause severe internal injury to the mother when applied forcefully to an obstruction of anatomical origin. In cases where the baby died during a prolonged obstructed labour, the midwife might use instruments of the most primitive and dangerous kind to attempt to extract the baby and save the mother, a procedure that frequently resulted in the mother's death from hemorrhage or from the infections that followed internal injury. Puerperal fever, the infection of the uterine wound following delivery that modern medicine understands as caused by the introduction of pathogenic bacteria into the birth canal, was the most common cause of maternal death following a delivery that had itself proceeded without obvious complication. In a world without any understanding of the germ theory of disease, without antisepsis, and without antibiotics, puerperal fever was a condition that the midwife and the attending women had no means of preventing and no means of treating once it was established. Its onset, typically 2 to 5 days following delivery with rapidly rising fever, shivering, severe abdominal pain, and the progressive deterioration of the mother's general condition, was observed by the women who attended her with a helplessness that must have been as distressing as it was familiar, since the condition was common enough to be recognised and named in the medical literature of the period, even if its cause was entirely misunderstood. Let us now turn to the specific religious dimension of her life, and to the ways in which the Church provided both framework and comfort for an existence whose physical demands were so relentless. Faith in the darkness, prayer, the saints, and the Church's hold on daily life. The Catholic Church was the single most pervasive institutional presence in Agnes's daily existence, more immediate in its practical demands and its psychological influence than any other institution she encountered, including the manorial system of the lord of the manor, the village community itself, and even the structures of the family. The Church's presence was not primarily a Sunday phenomenon, confined to the weekly Mass at the parish church and the seasonal rhythm of the major feasts, but was distributed through every hour of every day through the canonical structure of time, the liturgical calendar that governed the year, the sacramental framework that marked the turning points of individual life, and the vast and intricate system of prayer, observance and penitential practice that connected the individual believer to the institutional life of the universal church. The parish church of Agnes's village was a stone building, constructed in the late 11th century following the Norman conquest, replacing an earlier timber structure that had served the community through the Anglo-Saxon period. It was a modest building by the standards of the great Romanesque churches and cathedrals being constructed in the major centres of ecclesiastical life during this period, with a simple rectangular nave, a small chancel separated from the nave by a low chancel arch, and a bell tower at the west end whose single bell could be heard across the surrounding fields and woodland. The interior was painted in brilliant colours on every available surface, because the medieval church understood the visual decoration of its spaces as a form of theological instruction, a Bible of the poor that communicated the stories and teachings of Christianity to a population that was overwhelmingly unable to read. Agnes had grown up surrounded by these images, and the painted figure of the Last Judgment on the chancel arch, with its graphic depiction of the souls of the dead being sorted into heaven and hell, was as familiar to her as the faces of her neighbours. The parish priest who served Agnes's village during this period was a man named Osbert, installed in the living by the local lord of the manor, who held the right of advowson, which is to say, the legal right to appoint the priest of the parish church, a right that was one of the most valuable forms of ecclesiastical patronage available to the landed gentry of medieval England. Osbert was a man of modest education, able to read the Latin of the Mass and the Divine Office with sufficient fluency to perform the required liturgical ceremonies, but without the deeper theological formation of the university-trained clergy who served in the great cathedral and collegiate churches of the period. He heard confession from his parishioners at the required seasons of the year, administered the sacraments of baptism, matrimony, extreme unction, and burial, celebrated Mass in Latin every Sunday and on the major feast days, and preached a sermon in the English vernacular at the Sunday Mass, whose content was shaped primarily by the sermon aids and homiletic collections available to him in manuscript form. Agnes attended Mass every Sunday, and on the major feast days when her domestic obligations permitted, and she received the Easter Communion that was the canonical minimum required of all Christians, following the decree of the Fourth Lateran Council, held in Rome in the year 1215 under Pope Innocent III. Her relationship to the Mass was one of reverent attendance rather than active participation, because the liturgy was conducted entirely in Latin, which she could not understand, and from behind the screen that separated the nave, where the lay congregation stood or knelt, from the chancel, where the priest performed the liturgical actions at the altar. The central moment of the Mass, the elevation of the consecrated host at the moment of transubstantiation, was the primary devotional focus for the lay congregation, who strained to catch a glimpse of the elevated host through the gaps in the chancel screen, believing that the sight of the body of Christ had spiritual and even material benefits for those who witnessed it. The communal aspects of Sunday Mass attendance were as socially significant for Agnes as the liturgical and devotional ones, because the assembly of the parish community in the church and in the churchyard before and after the service was the most regular and most broadly inclusive social gathering in the village calendar, the moment when news was exchanged most comprehensively, when the community's social bonds were most publicly renewed, when disputes were aired and negotiations conducted, and when the fabric of village social life was most visibly displayed and maintained. The churchyard itself served as a social space of considerable importance, the gathering place before and after the service, where the community assembled in weather that permitted outdoor standing, conducting in the informality of the churchyard the social business that the formal context of the church interior did not easily accommodate. Her private devotional life was considerably richer and more personal than her attendance at the public liturgy might suggest. Agnes prayed in the vernacular, in the English that was her only language, using forms of prayer that had been transmitted through oral tradition rather than any written text, including the Ave Maria, which she recited in a vernacular version whose words she had learned from her mother, the Lord's Prayer in English, and various invocations of the saints whose particular patronage seemed most directly relevant to her daily needs and anxieties. St. Margaret of Antioch she invoked at every stage of pregnancy and as the birth approached. St. Bridget of Ireland she called upon for the protection of the household and its domestic economy. The Virgin Mary she addressed in a daily pattern of informal prayer that accompanied her work through the hours, a quiet internal conversation that provided both psychological comfort and the sense of connection to a divine presence attentive to the particular details of her life. The annual cycle of the liturgical calendar gave Agnes's year its most important rhythm of sacred time, dividing the 12 months into a pattern of seasons, feasts and fasts that structured not only her spiritual life but her domestic economy, her social relationships, and the rhythms of work and rest that governed the household. Lent, the 40-day penitential period before Easter, required fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, which in the medieval understanding meant abstaining from meat, dairy products and eggs, and consuming only bread, fish, and vegetables. For a peasant household whose diet was already severely limited and whose protein sources were already scarce, the additional Lenten restrictions on dairy and eggs represented a genuine nutritional challenge, and the Church's tradition of allowing the fish that was the canonical substitute for meat assumed a level of access to fish supplies that the inland peasant household did not reliably possess. The preservation of herring and other sea fish by drying and salting made them available in markets at a distance from the coast, and the purchase of dried fish at the Lenten season was a regular market transaction for many English villages, but it was a purchase that required coin and planning, and that added to the complexity of the household's Lenten management, in ways that the theological architects of the fasting regulations had not, in most cases, carefully considered from the perspective of the inland peasant wife. Let us now turn to the final sections of Agnes's day, and to the long night that waited at its end. The seasons of suffering, how the agricultural year shaped the wife's body. The agricultural year of medieval England imposed its demands upon Agnes's body with a seasonal specificity that meant her physical experience was not constant in its character, but varied dramatically according to the month, the crop cycle, and the particular combination of a weather and harvest outcome that each year produced. There were seasons of the year when her work, though unceasing, had a quality of relative physical manageability, and there were seasons, particularly the harvest weeks of late summer and the deepest weeks of winter, when the physical demands placed upon her were at the absolute limit of what a human body could sustain. The harvest season, which typically ran from late July through to mid-September, depending upon the specific crop and the weather of the particular year, was the period of greatest combined labour demand for every member of the household, and it was also the period when Agnes's domestic responsibilities underwent the least reduction, despite the additional demand of field work. The grain harvest was dominated by urgency, by the knowledge that the window between the ripening of the grain and the onset of the autumn rains was narrow and could close without warning, and that failure to bring in the harvest within that window could mean a winter of hunger or worse for the household. During harvest, Agnes worked in the fields from first light until the light failed, binding the cut grain into sheaves and setting them in stocks to begin drying, or carrying the dried sheaves on her back to the collection point at the edge of the field, where the harvest wain waited to carry them to the threshing floor. This work was performed in the heat of late summer, with the prickle of cut grain stalks against her skin, the chaff in her hair and eyes, and the ache of constant stooping and straightening working its way through her lower back and hips. The harvest supper provided by the lord of the manor at the close of the harvest, a custom documented in the manorial accounts of many English estates through the 13th and 14th centuries, was one of the few occasions in the year when Agnes and the other women of the village ate food of a quality and quantity that exceeded the ordinary provision of the household diet. The Lord's harvest supper, or harvest home as it was sometimes called in the period, might include roasted meat, white bread, and quantities of ale far in excess of what the ordinary household could produce, and it represented an annual moment of genuine festive pleasure in an existence that offered very little of what could honestly be described as pleasure. It was also, from the Lord's perspective, a calculated investment in the labour goodwill of his tenants, a gesture of reciprocal generosity that the manorial management tradition recognised as a practical tool for maintaining the cooperation of the villein workforce through another year of service obligation. The winter, by contrast, brought a different and in some ways equally severe set of physical challenges. The cold of a 12th century English winter in a thatched peasant longhouse, without glazed windows or any form of heating beyond the central open hearth, was not the comfortable, insulated cold of a modern house with inadequate heating, but a penetrating and persistent cold that permeated clothing, bedding, and the bodies of those exposed to it continuously. The dampness of the English winter added to the cold's penetrating quality, and the condensation that formed on the interior walls of the house, combined with the moisture produced by the animal's breath in the byre and the steam from the cooking pot, created an interior atmosphere of high humidity that made the cold feel worse and that created conditions hospitable to the respiratory infections and joint conditions that were among the most common causes of illness and disability in the medieval peasant population. The nutritional dimension of the winter was also at its most challenging during the months of January through March, when the stored supplies from the harvest were at their lowest point before the new season's garden could begin to produce. The household's grain store, carefully measured and rationed through the autumn and early winter, was now at a level that required careful daily management to prevent running short before the first spring harvest of peas and early vegetables could provide some relief. Agnes managed this rationing with complete competence and without any external oversight, because it was entirely within her domain of practical management, and the consequences of mismanagement fell upon her and her children as directly and immediately as upon any other member of the household. In years of poor harvest, this winter nutritional management could involve genuine sacrifice, with Agnes reducing her own consumption to ensure sufficient food for the youngest and most vulnerable members of the household, a pattern of maternal self-denial that the historical and anthropological literature consistently identifies as a universal feature of food-stressed household economies. The spring, when it finally arrived in March or April with the warming of the soil and the first growth of fresh vegetation in the hedgerows and fields, brought both a relief from the worst of the winter's nutritional and thermal hardships and a new intensification of outdoor labour demands as the preparation of the garden and the management of the livestock returning to outdoor grazing added their claims to an already full schedule of domestic obligation. It is worth resting for a moment in the thought that for Agnes, spring was not primarily an experience of aesthetic pleasure in the greening of the landscape and the return of warmth, though she was undoubtedly responsive to those qualities in the way that any human being is responsive to them, but primarily an experience of logistical shift, of one set of pressing obligations giving way to a different but equally pressing set, the wheel of the agricultural year turning with its own steady, patient, unrelenting authority. The particular horror of the late winter period, known in the historical literature as the Hungry Gap or the pre-harvest dearth, which fell roughly between February and May, when the previous year's stored grain was at its lowest, and the new season's garden had not yet produced significant food, was a recurring feature of the medieval peasant year, whose effects fell most heavily upon the youngest children, and upon pregnant and nursing mothers. Agnes's management of the household's food supply during this period was an exercise in extreme domestic economy, reducing portions, substituting less nutritious forage plant material for the grain, and preserved vegetables that formed the normal base of the diet, and prioritising the feeding of the working adults and the youngest children over her own consumption in ways that left her own body depleted in the specific nutrients, particularly iron and calcium, that her multiple pregnancies had already drawn upon heavily. The foraging of wild plants from the hedgerows, woodland margins and common land of the village represented an important seasonal supplement to the household's food supply, and the wife's knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and which were toxic was a practical body of information whose accuracy could be a matter of literal survival. Nettles, gathered from the nitrogen-rich soil around the midden heap and the field margins in early spring, were boiled into a vegetable of some nutritional value. Wild garlic, which grew in the damper areas of the woodland floor from February onward, provided flavouring and some antimicrobial benefit. Hawthorn buds and young leaves were eaten raw or added to the pottage pot in the early weeks of their production. Elderflowers, gathered in May and June, were infused in hot water for a beverage, or fried in a thin batter on the hearthstone. The management of this seasonal foraging calendar, added to all the other dimensions of Agnes's daily labour, was simply another unremarked competence in a life built entirely of unremarked competences. Let us now turn to the final hours of Agnes's night, and to the specific character of the darkness that concluded her day, the night's end, sleep, waking, and the morning that always returned. The darkness that fell over Agnes's village at the end of a day in October in the year 1142 was a darkness of a quality that is genuinely difficult for the modern mind to fully reconstruct, because it was a darkness unrelieved by any artificial light beyond the faint glow of the household fires, visible through the chinks in the wattle walls of the houses, and the very occasional moving light of a torch or rushlight carried by someone with business in the village after dark. Beyond the village boundary, the darkness of the open fields and the surrounding woodland was essentially complete on cloudy nights, and the human world contracted to the small warm radius of each household's firelight, beyond which lay the cold and the dark and the various physical and spiritual dangers that the medieval mind associated with the night. Agnes lay down on the sleeping platform beside William, in the darkness of the banked fire's last faint glow. And the physical experience of that lying down deserves a moment of careful attention, because it was not the experience of a person retiring to a comfortable bed at the end of a satisfying day, but the experience of a body at the end of its daily resources lowering itself onto a surface that provided only partial relief from the aching that had accumulated through 16 or 17 hours of continuous physical work. The straw mattress had been turned, and the straw redistributed that morning, but it was old straw, beginning to break down and lose its cushioning quality, and the wooden slats of the sleeping platform were perceptible through its diminishing depth in the pressure points of hips and shoulders. The woolen blankets were warm but scratchy, made from the coarse fleece of the household sheep without the softening treatments available to wealthier households, and the familiar smell of the bedding, smoke and wool, and the faint animal smell of the bodies that had slept beneath it through many months was simply the smell of sleep and of home. The intimate life of the marriage proceeded in this space, in the dark, in the close proximity of the sleeping children at the other end of the platform, in the cold of the October night outside the blankets, and in the context of Agnes's 6th pregnancy, and William's end-of-day tiredness that she was aware of, and that was matched by her own exhaustion of a depth and comprehensiveness that modern language barely has words to capture. The Church's teaching about the marital debt, the mutual obligation of husband and wife to render intimate access upon request, was a framework that both of them had absorbed through their upbringing in the parish culture of 12th century England without ever having read a single line of canon law, and its practical expression in their marriage was shaped by the full weight of their daily physical reality, by William's understanding of the demands Agnes bore, by Agnes's awareness of the theological obligation she carried, and by the simple human negotiation of two people living in very close proximity with very limited resources of time, energy, and privacy. The sleep that followed, when it came, was rarely uninterrupted. The 2-year-old woke through the night for nursing, typically at least once and sometimes twice between the household's initial settling and the pre-dawn rising that began the cycle again. The animals in the byre occasionally made noise. The fire, poorly banked, might need attention in the deep hours of the night. A sick child might require management. And the particular sleep disruption of late pregnancy, which Agnes was beginning to experience in the weeks following the recognition of her 6th pregnancy, would in the coming months add its own specific catalogue of physical discomforts to the already considerable challenges of the night hours. The quality of sleep available to the medieval peasant wife has been the subject of considerable historical and anthropological interest, particularly following the historian Roger E. Kirch's influential study of pre-industrial sleep patterns at Day's Close, published in 2005, in which he argued on the basis of extensive documentary evidence including literary texts, medical manuals and court records that the standard sleep pattern of pre-industrial Europe was not a single uninterrupted period of sleep, but a 2-phase pattern consisting of a first sleep from initial retiring to approximately midnight, a period of waking lasting an hour or more in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep lasting through to morning. Whether Agnes experienced this 2-phase pattern is uncertain, but the documentary evidence that Kirch marshals from the medieval and early modern periods suggests that it was a widely recognised feature of the pre-industrial sleep experience, and that the period of waking in the middle of the night was used for prayer, for quiet reflection, for intimate relations between husband and wife, and for various practical tasks that could be accomplished in the dim firelight of the banked hearth. At some point before 4 o'clock in the morning, the fire's diminishment from its banked state to insufficient warmth, the stirring of the animals in the byre, or the rooster's first call would alert Agnes's sleeping body to the approach of dawn, and the process of waking would begin. She would surface from whatever depth of sleep her body had managed to reach, aware before she was fully conscious of the cold and the darkness, and the specific ache in her lower back, and the faint nausea of early pregnancy. And she would lie still for a moment in the darkness, the last moment of anything approaching stillness that the coming day would offer her, before her feet met the cold earth floor, and the cycle of the medieval wife's day began again. It began again as it had always begun. It would begin again tomorrow. It had begun this way for every woman who had slept in this house before her, and it would begin this way for every woman who would sleep here after her. The fire needed tending. The animals needed feeding. The children would wake. The pottage pot waited on its hook, and the long, relentless, quietly extraordinary day of the medieval wife stretched out ahead, exactly as it always did, from the cold darkness before dawn to the cold darkness of night, with nothing in between but work and love and endurance, and the quiet, private persistence of a life that the formal record of history barely acknowledged and could never entirely erase. If you have found this careful and honest exploration of the medieval wife's daily life to be a thoughtful companion for your evening rest tonight, a gentle like on the video is always warmly and sincerely appreciated, and it helps this kind of detailed historical content reach the people who are looking for it. Subscribing to the channel means you will be among the first to discover each new exploration of medieval, Roman, Victorian and Viking history as it becomes available, and we would be genuinely glad to hear in the comments which historical period or topic you would most like us to turn our attention to next. You might also find our earlier video on life inside a medieval monastery to be a similarly steady and restful companion for a quiet evening. We're always glad to know where in the world you're settling in tonight. Tonight we have followed Agnes through the complete arc of her day in 12th century England, tracing every hour from the cold pre-dawn darkness when she rose to tend the fire, through the long morning of cooking, brewing and outdoor labour, through the midday demands of the manorial economy and the village market, through the afternoon of textile work and child rearing, through the evening meal and its domestic rituals, and into the night with its intimate obligations, its interrupted sleep, and the quiet persistence of a body that would rise tomorrow and do it all again. We have examined the legal framework of marriage that subsumed her identity into her husband's, the theological system that regulated the most intimate dimensions of her life with extraordinary specificity, the medical reality of pregnancy and childbirth that returned to her again and again through the years of her adult life, and the seasonal rhythm of the agricultural year that shaped every hour she lived with its own patient, relentless authority. The historical significance of this life is precisely its ordinariness. Agnes was not exceptional. She was the norm. She was the majority experience of adult womanhood in medieval Europe, and the institutions that shaped her existence, its law, its church, its manorial economy, and its daily material conditions, were the creation of a society that relied upon the labour and endurance of women like her for its basic functioning, while granting them almost no formal recognition, no legal independence, and no protection against the many forms of difficulty their lives contained. To everyone who has spent this evening in Agnes's company, a sincere and genuine word of thanks. These lives deserve to be known. They deserve the careful attention that recovers them from the margins of the historical record and places them where they belong, at the very centre of the human story. The fire she tended, the bread she made, the children she raised, the prayers she offered in the dark, all of it mattered, and all of it is worthy of our quiet, attentive recognition across the distance of 9 centuries. Good night, and sleep well.